Record. All right, so we have started recording. I can see folks coming in and joining. Welcome. As you come in, feel free to use the chat, and if you'd like to, you can introduce yourself. You can tell us where you're logging in from. Tell us why you're here. If you have something that you're interested in as far as the fishery or just something that you're passionate about on the Teton River, we'd love to hear that. Yeah, and so for about the first 5 or 10 minutes here, I'm going to make a few announcements and get us oriented to the Zoom platform, make some introductions, and then we'll get Max rolling on his presentation. But we want to give a little bit of time here for people to join the webinar. Let's see. You should see the chat down there at the bottom. So feel free to type in your name and where you're coming from. Let's see. As we're getting ready, I wanted to let everyone know of another event we have coming up next week with the Jackson Hole Clean Water Coalition. On Tuesday, April 19th, we're going to have our Trout Friendly Lawns certification event. The Trout Friendly Lawns program is a program for landscapers and businesses and also residents and homeowners to implement trout-friendly landscaping practices on their properties. So these are things like reducing the amount of fertilizer you use, getting on a watering schedule to reduce your water consumption, cutting your grass a little bit taller so it stays greener between waterings. And we're pretty excited to be launching that over on the Teton Valley side this summer as a way that we can participate in protecting water quality and also conserving water. Hannah is going to drop a link in the chat there. And so if you haven't already, you can check it out on the Clean Water Coalition website. You can share that with friends and professional contacts who might be interested. Also wanted to let everyone know that we're getting pretty excited about the summer season here at Friends of the Teton, and we have a lot of events and field tours planned. We're going to be heading out to field sites where we're doing river restoration, heading out to irrigation diversions where we have fish screen, checking out projects in Canyon Creek. We'll have a farm tour in coordination with the county fair. That's going to be later in August. But all of those things are great opportunities to meet other people who are invested in the watershed, to get connected to the Teton River, and to learn more about Friends of the Teton River's work. And Hannah is also going to put a link for our newsletter into the chat. That is where we advertise all of our events. We also put a lot of informative information, announcement from partners, and we try to keep that coming out every week or two in the summer season. So if you haven't already, you can subscribe there to stay up to date. Let's see. So what I want to do now that we've got a pretty good full room here, just wanted to make an introduction. I'm Will Stubblefield. I'm the Director of Community Education here at Friends of the Teton River. We have Hannah Orcutt-Moot. She is our Director of Philanthropy. And we also have Max Lewis here, who is our Fisheries Program Manager. He's going to be really leading the show tonight. So we're going to kind of trade off as we go through the night, but those are the folks here from Friends of the Teton who are going to be talking. Max is getting our slideshow set up here, and we wanted to start off by sharing with you the mission of Friends of the Teton River. At Friends of the Teton River, we work to restore and conserve the Teton River watershed to ensure a lasting legacy of clean water, healthy streams, and a vibrant wild fishery. We implement programs and projects that are founded on sound science, community education, and cooperation with landowners, citizens, and agency partners. And tonight you're getting a really awesome picture of our fisheries program, which is just one part of FTR's work. We also do work for stream restoration on the Teton River watershed, water quality monitoring and sampling. Max will talk some about that. We have a farms and fish program where we cooperate with the ag community to implement best management practices that benefit water quality and also help with water conservation and water availability. And there's our community education and outreach program. So we're pretty excited about all these different ways that we work for the watershed. And again, excited to share our fisheries program with you tonight. So I want to really quickly, just you as a webinar attendee have a screen that looks something like this. You're probably seeing Max's screen, and you only have really 3 buttons at the bottom. So during the webinar, feel free to use the chat to chat with friends. You can add comments and kind of stay engaged that way. The Q&A is the best way to ask a question. And so if you have a question that arises during the webinar, you can type that into the Q&A box, and that will actually log those questions, and I'll be able to see them. And later on during the question and answer session after the presentation, we can go through and address those questions when we have our question and answer. Later on, the raise hand button, this will let us know that you have a question, and maybe you just want to speak out and ask your question instead of typing it in. So after the presentation, you can use that raise hand button. I'll see that your hand is raised, and I'll be able to unmute you as a participant and allow you to speak up and ask your question in front of the group. So those are your settings here for the Zoom webinar. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Max. And so, like I said, Max is our Fisheries Program Manager. Max is entering his 3rd season at FTR in the field science realm. He started as a field science technician, and he's grown his role in this program to being the Fisheries Program Manager now. And what I think is really cool about this presentation is you're getting a picture of a whole year's worth of work for Max. So starting here in the spring, he's planning the objectives for the summer. He's getting everything ready, checking on the field sites. Throughout the summer, he's out there monitoring, collecting data, collaborating with agency partners. And then during the fall and winter, he's actually analyzing all that data and trying to figure out what we learned. And then that puts us right here in the spring where we're ready to communicate out to you all. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Max.
Great. Thanks a bunch, Will, for the introduction and for putting together tonight's talk and allowing us to present on what FTR does and what I work on throughout the year. And thanks to everyone for being here. Hopefully some of you attended last year's State of the Fishery. This one will be somewhat similar to that, with new data from this year, as well as an introduction to FTR's Fisheries and Field Monitoring Program. So as Will mentioned, we have a mission statement at FTR, and then we have ways that we ensure that we are pursuing that mission and actively bettering the Teton River watershed. An aspect of my job that I spend a lot of time on is to restore and conserve Yellowstone cutthroat trout populations in the Teton River watershed. I also work to monitor, restore, and conserve surface and groundwater quality in the Teton River watershed. And then my boss, Mike Lean, who's been working in the Teton River watershed for over a decade, works to restore and conserve healthy functioning stream channels, floodplains, riparian areas, and natural wetlands in the watershed. And then, as you know from Will's introduction of himself, he provides watershed education. He provides watershed education for current and next generation of water stewards and users. And then we all work together to promote a strong and sustainable organization here at FTR. And a lot of this work can't be done without a few key partners that are shown here on the screen. We have a variety of other partners that work with us on a multitude of projects, but these are some key partners, and they're partners I'm going to present. Some of these partners created the data that I'll present tonight. Idaho Fish and Game has created population estimates for the fishery in the Teton River watershed, and they're of course responsible for the management of the fishery and wildlife in our region. And then the Henry's Fork Foundation provides a lot of data analysis to FTR, as well as providing water year outlooks that I'll be presenting later on in the presentation. Wyoming Game and Fish manages the very top of our watershed on the Wyoming side and in the Teton Wilderness. And the U.S. Forest Service, of course, is a really important land manager at the headwaters of our watershed. Some of you may not be well acquainted with where we work. This map depicts the Teton River watershed in its entirety. I'm presenting from Driggs today in the heart of the Teton Valley. The Teton River watershed starts in the headwaters of the Tetons high in the wilderness, as well as the Big Hole Mountain Range. The Teton River flows in the Upper Valley section and then drops steeply into a remote and relatively inaccessible canyon section of the Teton River. As it nears Rexburg, it eventually joins the Henry's Fork of the Snake River and then the Mighty Snake River. A lot of our work is focused in this Upper Teton River Valley, as we have a lot of tributary streams there that are really important tributaries to the Upper River, and it's a place where a lot of folks go to recreate. And then the Teton River Canyon section is a hard to access place, but another area in the Teton River where we've done a substantial amount of research, monitoring, and restoration work. As I mentioned in our mission, and as I mentioned in our goals are to conserve and protect Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Yellowstone cutthroat trout are a native fish species to the watershed and to the region. Unfortunately, they're a species of concern, as Yellowstone cutthroat trout only currently occupy 43% of their historic range, and only 23% of those fish are genetically unaltered, as in they have not hybridized with rainbow trout or are not introduced via hatchery stock of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. In the green circle, you can see where we are in that historic range, in that native range, and we're just to the left of that big blue swath that represents Yellowstone National Park, kind of the place where Yellowstone cutthroat trout are in the best shape. If any of you have come to an FTR presentation in the past, you may have seen this graph. It's a population estimate graph created by Idaho Fish and Game Department, and it's created after their raft-based electrofishing surveys. As you can see, in 2003, there's a really low abundance of total trout, but there's a really shockingly low abundance of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. It was found in 2003 that Yellowstone cutthroat trout only comprised 3% of the fish population found in the Upper Teton River. And this lit a fire under a lot of anglers, watershed stewards, and residents of the Teton Valley. Those folks came together and created FTR and created our mission. As a Fisheries Program Manager, these are some of my goals and the guiding principles of the work that I do day to day. Those are to determine long-term trout population trends, to provide the agencies with additional data on the Teton River watershed, to identify, prioritize, and design Yellowstone cutthroat trout conservation projects, whether they be research projects or they be restoration projects. And then we really want to monitor the efficacy of those conservation projects. We want to ensure the time we spend and the money we spend on this work is thoughtful and well done work that's going to benefit the ecosystem as a whole. A cornerstone of FTR's monitoring program is a basin-wide electrofishing survey. The survey was first established in 2005, and it is repeated once every 5 years. FTR fills a need in that we are able to do a really expansive and detailed survey throughout the tributary streams in our watershed, where an agency partner may not have the capacity to send a field crew of 6 or 8 folks out in the field every day all summer long. We completed one of these once every 5 year surveys in 2020. We'll complete one again in 2025. In 2020, we only did some of the survey sites as we didn't have the capacity to go to every single site throughout the watershed. We completed 68 surveys that are highlighted here on the map by the yellow and blue dots. And we chose really important tributary streams to the Teton watershed. These streams are either important because they hold a genetically pure population of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. They may have a mix of non-native fish and native fish, where we're trying to monitor to see if Yellowstone cutthroat trout are expanding or decreasing in the face of those native fish, or they're places where we've either completed restoration projects or plan to complete restoration projects. In 2015, we did do one of those complete surveys. In 2025, we plan to do that again. And here you can see all the survey sites FTR has established and surveyed twice in the past, 2005 and 2015. The yellow dots represent survey sites where we found Yellowstone cutthroat trout. The blue dots are survey sites where we found eastern brook trout, and the red dots are sites where we found rainbow trout. And here's some data analysis provided by Rob Van Kirk at the Henry's Fork Foundation of the data that we collect during those semi-annual surveys on our tributary streams. Those 15 years of data have revealed a small decrease in total trout abundance in our tributary stream systems. But they have also revealed that Yellowstone cutthroat trout have stayed stable over time at 45% of all fish captured are Yellowstone cutthroat trout. We are concerned with a small decrease in fish abundance, but it should be noted that because the survey varies once every 5 years and it's not all the same sites, it's not exactly replicating once every 5 years, and there is some potentially there's a level of inaccuracy within that 2% number. So it's only a marginally significant decrease. I'm going to move on to share some information collected by the Idaho Fish and Game Department via their semi-annual population estimate surveys. These are surveys that are conducted by using electrofishing equipped raft. These rafts are float down the Teton River. They temporarily stun fish. These fish can then be collected, data collected from the fish, and that data is used to create an estimate of how many fish are present at that survey site or in that stretch of the river. In the top left, you'll see the top left of the map, you'll see the Parkinson tagging reach. In the middle of the map, between Driggs and Teutonia, you'll see the Breckenridge tagging reach and the Nickerson tagging reach. I'll share data from all those reaches, as well as from the South Fork of the Teton River down near Rexburg, which is not pictured in this map. So here's the population estimate data from the South Fork of the Teton River. This goes from Orange Bridge, which I believe is 3,300 in Rexburg, to the confluence with the Henry's Fork River. And this survey site is not as often surveyed. And the South Fork of the Teton River is a place where FTR has yet to do a substantial amount of work. But it's a section of the river that definitely needs some restoration projects, and it's a relatively degraded section of the Teton River. There, they've only estimated 161 trout per mile total. Of those are 24 Yellowstone cutthroat trout per mile. And what's really shocking or maybe surprising is that they estimate 84 brown trout per mile down in that section of the river. As you can see in the graph, there's been a pretty tremendous increase in brown trout numbers, while we've seen a decrease in Yellowstone cutthroat trout numbers. That's a trend that FTR is really aware of and wants to ensure is not mirrored elsewhere in the watershed. So it gives us a really good example of what could potentially happen when you see a tremendous increase in brown trout. It should also be noted that there is not a lot of recruitment in this section of the river, as in there's not a lot of reproduction. It's hypothesized that fish are moving into this section of the Teton River, potentially from the Henry's Fork, as we find a lot of really large fish in the South Fork of the Teton, but not a lot of young fish in those surveys. Moving upstream and into the Teton River Canyon, a really wild and beautiful place. If you've ever had the opportunity to go to the Teton River Canyon, you're lucky. And if you haven't, you should check it out down there sometime. Anyway, the Parkinson Reach of the Teton River is between Hog Hollow and the Felt Dam site. As you can see, it's not often surveyed, but we've seen a tremendous increase in Yellowstone cutthroat trout in that section of the river. And it's a really encouraging sign for the species and for the Teton River watershed as a whole. In a 2020 survey, Idaho Fish and Game estimated that there's 1,229 Yellowstone cutthroat trout per mile. That is 3 times higher than the 2015 estimate of 389 fish per mile. It can't all be contributed to restoration work, but it is of note that within those 5 years, FTR completed significant fish passage work on Canyon Creek, a spawning tributary near this site, and it is also working on water rights acquisition and creating more in-stream flow on Canyon Creek actively right now. So we're really hoping to continue to benefit that spawning tributary on behalf of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. We hope to see that this section of the river continues to have a really, really strong population of fish. We're going to move upstream to the Nickerson Reach of the Teton River. This is between South Bates and Bates Bridges, really popular section of river for folks to fish on and to recreate on. And this is kind of our bellwether of how the fisheries population is doing in the Upper Teton River. It's the Idaho Fish and Game site in the Teton River Valley that historically has had the most abundant Yellowstone cutthroat trout and some of the most abundant total fish numbers. So we really monitor this site closely and really pay attention to what the fish population is doing at this site. As you can see in the graph, there's been a decrease in total abundance of fish, as well as a slight decrease in the number of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. In the 2021 survey, Idaho Fish and Game estimated there are 370 fish per mile in that section of the river. That's approximately 21% of the total fish found in that section of the river. It should be noted, though, that the 10-year average is 383 fish. So while we've seen a decrease over the last few years, it's still on par with what we see as a historical carrying capacity for total fish abundance. The total trout abundance in this section of the river is 1,741 trout per mile, with brook trout being the most abundant species. And then we're going to go slightly back downstream, closer to Tetonia, is the Breckenridge Reach of the Teton River. That's between Pack Saddle and Harris Bridges. And here at the Breckenridge Reach, we've always had historically less Yellowstone cutthroat trout and more non-native fish. It's hypothesized that there's less spawning tributary access for Yellowstone cutthroat trout in this section of the river, just because there are less tributaries flowing into that section of the river. In 2021, it was estimated there are 56 Yellowstone cutthroat trout per mile. That's above the 10-year average, but below the 2019 estimate slightly. And then one thing that FTR is very aware of and concerned with is an increasing number of brown trout in the Breckenridge Reach of the Teton River. It's only since 2019 that Idaho Fish and Game has found abundant enough brown trout to run a population estimate equation. This year, they estimate that there are 192 brown trout per mile. This is a lot. This is higher than the 2019 estimate and much higher than the surveys before that. When you look at this data, as far as the species composition, the percentage of fish in that section of the river, it's really quite staggering, the increase in brown trout in that section of river. This year, that section of the river is comprised of 16.1% brown trout compared to 5.7% Yellowstone cutthroat trout. It was only in 2015 that there was an abundant enough number of brown trout where we could really say that they are a significant part of the population. In 2015, there was 1.9% brown trout, total trout. 2017, it was 2.8%. 2019, it was 7.9%. And as I said, 2021 is 16.1%. So it's not quite an exponential increase in brown trout numbers, but it's a pretty staggering increase in brown trout in that section of the river. Moving on, I'll fill you all in on the annual monitoring we do. So this is the monitoring that FTR has been doing for a number of years. These are things that our agency partners have advised us to do, and really appreciate the data we collect via this monitoring. I'll touch on pit tagging, pit tag array maintenance, red surveys, our water quality monitoring program, our in-stream temperature monitoring program, and talk a little bit about some of the fish screens and restoration work we have and I maintain. Pit tagging, PIT stands for Passive Integrated Transponder. You can see in the top left, Matt is inserting a pit tag into that nice cutthroat trout in that photo. These tags each have a unique number. When a fish is tagged with one of these tags, we write down that unique number. We write down the fish's species, its sex, its length, weight, and where we captured that fish. We then have antennas throughout the watershed where if that tagged fish passes through that antenna, we'll detect that we'll detect that tag, and then we'll know the information on that fish. And it's mostly used for detecting spawning fish moving into tributary streams, or maybe non-native fish that we don't want to detect in some of these tributary streams. So it really informs us on that spawning timing and gives us a lot of other life history data. We've tagged over 5,000 fish throughout the effort, and just last year we tagged 471 fish. Most of the tags that we put out into the watershed and into these fish are during the Idaho Fish and Game population estimate surveys. We assist Idaho Fish and Game with these surveys, acting as a volunteer boat where we collect a lot of data on behalf of them and pass it back to them for their population analyses. Big part, though, of the pit tagging program and detecting these fish is array maintenance. These things can prove to be a bit of a headache, and a lot of our antennas are a little bit old, they just hadn't been updated in a number of years. So this year we got some funding from the Teton Conservation District to revamp and rebuild 2 of these antennas. One on Upper Teton Creek. Teton Creek is one of the most important spawning tributaries for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and FTR is really interested to find out how many Yellowstone cutthroat trout can make it from the mouth of the Teton Creek at the confluence of the Teton River all the way upstream and into those wilderness headwaters. So this upstream one on Teton Creek is in Alta, and finding fluvial fish moving up that far means that fish can pass all these irrigation diversions that are on Teton Creek, but it also means they're likely to be entrained in those irrigation diversions on their way back downstream. So it's important to monitor fish moving there. And then we also revamped a site on Upper Bitch Creek, high up close to the wilderness, or high up in the forest there. And that's a place where we're really monitoring to see if non-native fish are showing up. There are rainbow trout at the mouth of Bitch Creek, but they have not been documented high up in Bitch Creek, where we have a really important stock of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Just some data that these pit tags give us. In this graph, you'll see our 3 most active sites this year being Teton Creek, Fox Creek, and Six Springs Creek. Teton Creek is by far annually our most active pit tag site, where we detect the most fish moving upstream to spawn. There we detected 87 fish. Six Springs is a really amazing spring creek system that is on the Teton Regional Land Trust property. It's a tributary to Teton Creek, and we have a pit tag site there as well. There we detected 5 fish. And Six Springs Creek is a really unique system, and that's a spring creek that's had a lot of restoration work done, and it's a spring creek that remains untrammeled. Teton Regional Land Trust does graze cattle in that landscape, but they have a lot of cattle exclosures and move their cattle to ensure that they wouldn't ever be in the stream during the important spawning season. And it's a place that we have a really intensive study. We also do red surveys there, and our pit tag data just adds to that data set on Six Springs Creek. And then we have Fox Creek at the Fox Creek East public access site, where many of you may have gone to fish. At that site, we have another pit tag detection site where we capture Yellowstone cutthroat trout moving upstream. And then also we are very aware that there's a number of rainbow trout in that area. So you want to monitor how many rainbow trout are moving upstream in Fox Creek and at what time they're moving upstream. And then here's some more interesting data that just shows the correlation between pit tagged fish moving through our antennas, so moving into these tributary systems to begin their spawning run, and the hydrograph, the amount of water moving down the stream in the Teton River. And this relationship that you see in this graph is one that we see almost annually. It's with the first spike, that first preliminary spike in the spring runoff, the meltwater coming down through the system, is when we see that fish are triggered to move up into these spawning tributaries. And it's a relationship we like to maintain and monitor, because any substantial change to that hydrograph could potentially allow for rainbow trout and Yellowstone cutthroat trout spawning habits to move into the same time period and create more hybridized trout, and thus reduce the strength of Yellowstone cutthroat trout's genetics and their genetics. Another part of our monitoring program is Yellowstone cutthroat trout and brown trout red surveys. Reds are what is referred to as the nests that trout make when they spawn. Two trout come together to reproduce. They thrash in the substrate in the really clean clean sorted gravel, and that cleans the gravel and makes it visible for the surveyor. Some of these survey sites are sites where we go back and do a comparative study, such as on Six Springs Creek, where we've been year after year. And there we can go year after year and compare how many reds we find to see if there's any change in the number of fish using that system. This year in Six Springs Creek, which is a very small spring creek system, we found 30 reds, so at least 30 spawning pairs of Yellowstone cutthroat trout entered that system and reproduced there, which is really heartening. We also have red surveys established on sites where we have either completed restoration work or plan to complete restoration work in the future. And then we are working on establishing a raft-based brown trout red survey. The easiest way to access the Teton River in the fall and cover ground is via a raft. As many of you know, it's also a rather shallow river, and trout prefer to spawn in relatively shallow water. So we can use a raft to float down the river and find where brown trout, this emergent species in our watershed, are spawning and identify the habitat they prefer for spawning. This is a program we're going to expand upon in 2022 and try to normalize. This past year, on the right, you can see in that map, we identified 16 reds just on one section of the river. We want to expand upon that program and cover more parts of the river more often during the fall brown trout spawning period. Also in 2021, and a project that will likely continue into the future, Friends of the Teton River collaborated with Idaho Fish and Game, Alder Environmental Consultants, and the Bronze Buffalo Club in Victor, Idaho, to do some habitat and fisheries assessments on Warm Creek as it flows through the Bronze Buffalo Club's golf course. The Bronze Buffalo Club is interested in contracting Alder Environmental to do some ecological restoration work there. But to ensure that restoration work is necessary and well done, they contacted FTR, who worked with Idaho Fish and Game, to do some fisheries studies on Warm Creek. The purpose of this study is to better understand the creek system, but to also help to design those restoration projects and to ensure that the restored stream is on behalf of our native Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So what we did was we installed a weir that would not allow any fish to move downstream out of the system. It would allow water to continue to flow downstream naturally. And we transplanted some fluvial fish that were moving upstream into Teton Creek into Warm Creek to see if they could successfully spawn with the habitat that's currently available. I was out there weekly looking for reds on this system, just looking for these fish, and we did not find that they were able to successfully spawn. So that told us that this restoration project could be really beneficial, as we would hope that a restoration project like this could potentially benefit Warm Creek to a point where it could be a super productive place, much like Six Springs Creek is. And then I'm gonna move away from my work and move on to my boss, Mike Lean's work, who's the restoration director here at Friends of the Teton River. He's been doing stream restoration projects in the watershed for well over a decade and has restored thousands of feet of stream bank. But just this last year in 2021, and then recently in early 2022, he's had some really impactful, or FTR has put some really impactful restoration projects on the ground. Many of you may have seen the Bates restoration project right there at the boat ramp, which has improved that boat ramp, as well as the fish habitat downstream of the boat ramp. A little further downstream, we've been working with Robert Piquet, a local rancher and landowner, to restore stream bank on his property, where the channel had become over widened and it was no longer in a state that was pre-impact state. So what we try to do is narrow the stream channel, add some roughness to the stream banks, as well as add some complexity to the pool riffle sequence in that channel, which all benefits the fishery and returns the stream to something that mimics a pre-development state. In those two projects, he's restored 2,200 feet of stream bank. And we also work on irrigation diversions to ensure that they allow fish passage past these points of diversions, and to install fish screens. So you're seeing a fish screen on the left of your screen. That fish screen is in an irrigation diversion. That water is being delivered to that irrigation diversion to the water rights holders and the water users, and that fish screen is keeping fish out of that irrigation ditch and directing them back into the river. This saves hundreds to thousands of fish a year, and it's really important on some of these streams like South Lee and Badger Creeks, where we have a lot of native Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So part of my job is to maintain this screen day to day, and it's also to help Mike with getting a couple more screens on the ground. We're going to bring one screen online this year, thanks to some remodeling on Badger Creek. And then hopefully, if permits come through and funds as well, we'll add a fish screen to the Desert Canal on South Lee Creek. These will both have huge, tremendous positive impacts on the fishery and will really benefit the fishery for long term, as well as help out the irrigators with some of their infrastructure. And then another part of our programming and my job is water quality monitoring. We have 10 water quality monitoring sites throughout the watershed. This program was first started by Idaho DEQ, but due to lack of resources, FTR has been able to step in and take over the water quality monitoring program. I go to these sites twice a year, once in July and once in October. We sample for a number of different parameters, and later on in the spring or maybe early summer, we'll be sharing a full water quality report on our website where you can see what our water quality results are. We did find that this year that our water quality parameters were all within historical ranges, and there's nothing significantly alarming about our results this year. Stream temperature monitoring. It's proven to be really important throughout the history of our stream temperature monitoring program, especially last year as well with our hot, dry year, and potentially this year coming up with another low water year forecasted. FTR maintains 36 temperature loggers, which you can see on the map. On the left is an image of a temperature logger. You might be able to spot it. It's that little white PVC cap, and that's on Mail Cabin Creek up on Teton Pass. These are passive temperature loggers that just stay in the stream year round. They record temperature data once an hour, all year. And this temperature data gives us a really robust data set to better understand how stream temperatures impact fish. It helps us answer questions why certain fish are in certain tributary streams and why there may not be. It also gives us a good idea of what the impacts of drought, heat, lack of precipitation are on our stream temperatures. And then once we have a better understanding of our stream temperatures, we can look for any changes in total fish abundance or the presence or absence of a species. And the slide has been slow to load all day. It's got a couple of graphs on it. So here we go. Here's a bit of an idea of what we found at just two of those sites last year. We have Teton River above Teton Creek, just at the South Bates boat ramp. And then we have way downstream, down in the Teton River Canyon, we have at Spring Hollow, another logger. As you'll note in the foreground of both of these graphs, there's the green lines represent the temperature observed during the summer, spring, and fall of 2021. Both of those temperatures recorded significantly above average stream temperatures throughout June and into early July. That is because of the lack of precipitation we had last spring and the weak snowpack. While these stream temperatures were significantly above average of our recorded history at FTR, they were not within the lethal trout limit. Scientists throughout the West who study trout and salmonids have found that the lethal limit for trout is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And the temperature at which trout really begin to be stressed is right around 72 degrees Fahrenheit. We touched just about 70 degrees at both these sites for time periods, but the nighttime stream temperatures were lower. As the air cools down, the water cools down, and these fish are able to find that refugia and move to cooler water when they are not stressed out by warm temperatures. We'll be monitoring for stream temperature again this year and are really trying to keep our finger on the pulse and update folks with stream temperatures as this year comes about. And then some predictions and modeling, that's all provided by Rob Van Kirk at the Henry's Fork Foundation. Dr. Van Kirk produces a really great daily email with a water forecast for the Henry's Fork watershed. Of course, the Teton River is a tributary to the Henry's Fork, so it includes some really important information on the Teton. And I think one of the links we'll provide gives you a way to sign up for his daily forecasts. Anyway, his daily forecasts have been rather bleak recently. As you can see in the graph here, the blue line represents the 2022 prediction for the water year of natural stream flow in the Teton River. 2021, another bad water year, is represented in green. And then we have the average in red. We have an earlier than average peak stream flow predicted. It looks like about a week earlier than what we normally see. The Teton River is predicted to only have 56% of the average stream flow in the during this water year. And then of another note, we're the current snow water equivalent in our snowpack at the headwaters of our system throughout the whole watershed is at 68% of average. So we're lining up for a pretty poor water year. Thankfully, this recent storm that we have had the last few days has increased our snow water equivalent, and we have not yet peaked in total snow water equivalent. So hopefully if the storm keeps delivering, our peak snow water equivalent will continue to get pushed back a few more days, and we'll continue to add water to that snowpack. But no matter what, we're not going to reach average snow water equivalent this year. And then moving on and looking ahead, in 2022, we're going to continue our annual monitoring, the things that keep me busy and running around, and then we're going to add a couple more projects to help us better understand the fishery. Our added 2022 projects will be to collect Yellowstone cutthroat trout and rainbow trout genetic data on behalf of a couple of university students and professors at Idaho State University and University of Wyoming. These folks are doing some cutting edge genomic work where they can try to determine where Yellowstone cutthroat trout and rainbow trout are hybridizing. And then we can look at the habitat characteristics of those places where those fish are most likely to hybridize and determine what kind of habitat is causing these fish to hybridize and model the gene pool. And then we're also working to create and put on the ground an environmental DNA sampling event in order to determine the current extent of brown trout in the Teton River watershed. We're very aware of we're very aware of brown trout from the Pack Saddle Bridge downstream, but fisheries managers, as in Idaho Fish and Game, has not identified brown trout in numbers in other parts of the Teton River watershed, i.e. in the headwaters near Victor or in any tributary streams. FTR has taken it upon ourselves to try to fund this eDNA sampling event. eDNA is a technology where you simply filter a water sample through a filtering medium. That filtering medium captures the genetic data, the DNA, in that water column, i.e. fish scales, etc. And then we can send that off to a lab who will run the analysis for us and tell us if these species are present or absent. It's a really powerful technology for finding not abundant species, i.e. they're hard to get with electrofishing, and to tell us if they're there in low numbers, as they may be hard to find via other means. And I think that's all I've got today. So I'm going to reintroduce Hannah Mook, and thank you all for your time and watching our presentation.
Thank you, Max. Before we open it up to questions, I see that we have a couple questions in the Q&A. I wanted to really briefly just talk about how you can support this work. Max just shared a lot of work that happens at FTR year-round. We are a nonprofit, and Max talked about all of the agency partners that we have too, and we have some wonderful partners who support our work, but we also rely on individual donations to make this work happen. So you can check out our website, tetonwater.org, to learn about projects and to see how you can support them. And then I just wanted to mention 2 specific ways. One is our ongoing annual fund campaign. We fundraise year-round to support all of the work that Max does, that Mike does, that all of our staff do. And that supports annual monitoring, that supports projects like the Warm Creek project, and that supports our staff. Our staff work really hard year-round, so we rely on that annual fund campaign to make that happen. And then, as Max just mentioned, we are currently fundraising for the eDNA project. So we're fundraising for that this spring so that we can make it happen this summer and learn more about non-native fish in our watershed. So there's 2 QR codes. It's super easy with your smartphone to just scan those, and those will take you to those fundraising pages, or you can check out our website to learn more. And please reach out if you have any other questions about how you can support our work. We always love having volunteers or people to host events or get involved in other ways. So don't hesitate to reach out. And I'm going to pass it back to Will, who is going to facilitate our question and answer portion of tonight.
All right. Thanks, Hannah. And thank you, Max. We do have some questions that are coming in. We got a couple in the chat here. And so, Max, I'm just going to shoot some questions out at you. And folks, feel free to type them in if they're coming up, or raise your hand. I did see Tom raised his hand, so I'll get to you shortly. Max, first question I got is, this person is curious if the Yellowstone cutthroat trout spawn exclusively in these tributaries. If not, how frequently do they spawn in the Teton River proper?
Sure. Yeah, Yellowstone cutthroat trout do not spawn exclusively in tributaries. Some certainly do spawn in the mainstem of the Teton River. And you'll especially see that, further upstream where the Teton River has a lower velocity of water, and there's a lot more side channels and spring creeks in the upstreammost section of the Teton River. But in the higher velocity, further downstream portions of the Teton River, they need to escape those high flow events, as they'll both make it hard for the fish to hold in that part of the river, and it also could potentially scour out the eggs. So when there's those big spring runoff flows, that's not conducive to spawning. So fish move upstream into these tributary systems to try to find that calmer water, to find some shallower water, and to find places where the eggs that they lay won't be scoured out of the system. As far as how often Yellowstone cutthroat trout spawn in the mainstem, it's a really hard thing to monitor for, because if they are spawning in the mainstem, it's when the river is pretty high, and it might be like blown out, as in it's pretty muddy, it's not very clear, it's hard to see. But fish definitely do, but it's something that we don't have a really good grasp on at FTR, and I don't think a lot of folks have had a lot of success studying Yellowstone cutthroat trout spawning. Other fish species, such as rainbow trout, spawn before that runoff happens, when the river is still kind of at base flow. So people have been able to study that more effectively. But we haven't studied how many fish spawn in the mainstem.
Awesome. Cool. Let's see, Thomas, I saw your hand was up. Do you have a question still? It went up and then it went back down. So you should be able to chime in if you'd like at this point. Okay, let's see, not hearing from Tom.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I had a mute button on there. Yes, so I've been involved and been very aware of a major water pollution problem on the other side of the hill in Fish Creek. And there, over a period of just a few years, we lost our dominant mayfly hatches, which were PMDs. 90+% are gone, and they used to be prevalent on a really daily basis from the end of runoff until mid-August, and now they're almost non-existent. And the reason turns out to be pollution producing what you folks in the science community call eutrophication, or phosphorus and nitrogen excess, which produces lots of algae, and apparently, I guess, it smothers certain parts of the stream bottom where PMDs and maybe some other invertebrates inhabit. And so that group modeled somewhat after Friends of the Teton River, was called Friends of Fish Creek. Now it's called Protect My Water JH. And we've spent a fair amount of money trying to understand the problem and following a science-based approach as FDR has so well for so long. And there's multiple sources, but the bottom line is that we're way behind the curve, and it's a big problem to try to mitigate that and reverse it. And it really probably very, very expensive if we're able to do that. So I'm wondering two things. One, just a minor question is, when you mentioned Fish Creek, Max, you talking about that Fish Creek, or is there a Fish Creek on the west side of the Tetons?
We have Fish Creek on the west side as well.
Okay, so my question is FTR monitoring for that kind of pollution in the Teton, and specifically directly below Teton Springs and directly below the development at Teton Valley Lodge? And if so, what's it show? And if not, shouldn't we be doing that?
Yeah, so we monitor for water quality parameters. We do not have a macroinvertebrate monitoring program yet. I think in the future, that's something where FTR really could expand our monitoring. And we have found, luckily, on the Warm Creek system, which is just downstream of some of that development, you mentioned that there aren't impairments there. And then at the Teton, as far as Teton Valley Lodge goes, we have a monitoring site near the South Bates Bridge, which is a little ways downstream, but we don't have, actually it's a little bit further upstream. So it's downstream of the Teton Valley Lodge site. And we haven't found there to be a much of a pollutant problem. And we found that as far as angler reports go, that we've heard that there's still good macroinvertebrate populations. We do have in a lot of our Spring Creek systems, a lot of these systems that are fully on private property, that they're pretty degraded, and they have a lot of that algal growth and a lack of aquatic invertebrates there. And that's a place where FTR really does want to do some restoration work. It's just not the place we've made it yet. And that's a lot to do with kind of what restoration work can do to restore stream banks and keep potentially cattle exposed and reduce the sedimentation in those systems. Is work we strive to do.
One of the primary problems that we discovered is failing septic tanks on the West Bank over there. Now that's very different because it's so much more developed than is the property along the Upper Teton. So I guess we're probably protected in that way, but I would encourage us to nevertheless keep an eye on it, because fixing it is profoundly more expensive than preventing it. So anyway, great work you guys do. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question and for attending.
So I got another one that came in the chat, Max, and they said, what do you believe is the biggest threat to Yellowstone cutthroat trout populations in the watershed? Could it be water temps, water levels, increasing brown trout, etc.?
Yeah, so fisheries biologists and kind of academics throughout the West think it's a two-headed monster in between climate change and the impacts of climate change, as in increasing water temperatures and lower stream flows, and then non-native fish. Non-native fish are much more they have a much wider tolerance for degraded habitats, for warm waters, and a lot of times are much better suited to outcompete Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So when you combine the impacts of a changing climate, a warming, warming water column and water body, with the fact that there are already non-native fish here, those non-native fish kind of have a leg up in most scenarios, and in what most people believe to be the case. Rainbow trout have been around in the Teton for a long time, and they shouldn't be dismissed as not an issue facing Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Luckily, we've been able to find a kind of that Yellowstone cutthroat trout still inhabit that 20-25% range of total fish composition in the Upper Teton River, but we're really concerned with some of those tributary streams that have genetically pure Yellowstone cutthroat trout, as if rainbow trout get there, then that would alter the genetics and we'd lose that genetically pure stock. And then as far as brown trout goes, brown trout have been proven to extirpate native fish in other watersheds, native cutthroat of other subspecies in other watersheds nearby, where they've really just hammered the Yellowstone cutthroat trout population. So we are concerned that brown trout could have a really big impact, especially on the main stem where they're already present, as the main stem is suitable for brown trout to expand. So it's a two-headed monster, and I think yeah, preserving our native fish species is a pretty important effort, and non-native play a big role in reducing the abundance of our native fish species.
Good answer. We're kind of coming towards the end of our time. I don't have any other questions in the chat right now. Does anyone want to raise a hand? We got one here. RD Whipple, I'm going to allow you in, and if you unmute yourself, you're good to go. Yeah, I've got RD Whipple. I think if you unmute, let's see, I can ask you to unmute, then you're good to ask a question.
My question is, what is the impact of the phenomenal increase in recreational use of the Teton River on the fish numbers and population?
Yeah, so this is something we've talked often about with Idaho Fish and Game, and who have been helping us to monitor recreational impacts just on the user experience as well as that side. But they've found no impact to the fishery as a whole, no population level impacts. You know, of course, they have their limits, no Yellowstone cutthroat trout harvest, and then a limit on rainbow trout. So that's really helped. It's proven to help when they put that limit on Yellowstone cutthroat trout in preserving the population. But as far as the population level impact, Idaho Fish and Game has not declared that the recreational fishing or recreationists have had an impact. But of course, it is something that impacts the recreationists, the day-to-day folks out there on the river, and those who are out there to fish. It does make it tougher.
Becoming confrontational.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for that question. That is definitely something that is on all of our minds in the Teton Valley. Any more questions? Awesome. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more hands up at this moment. So I just want to thank Max for an awesome presentation, shared a lot of great data and information with us. Hannah, thanks for your announcement and making it possible for folks to connect with our work and support us. Like Hannah said, you can check us out at tetonwater.org, and that's where you can sign up for our newsletter, learn more about our work, check our events calendar to see how you can join us in the field this summer, and even come out and visit Max and possibly see some of these spawning sites and work that he's doing. Yeah, we're looking forward to the field season and the summer river season, and hoping to see you all out there. Thanks again for joining us tonight. All right.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Have a good one.